So today we've got two lessons about people being healed from skin diseases. And this week in the lectionary always makes me laugh because I like to imagine the lectionary committee sitting there with their Bibles and trying to make good pairings of lessons that go together thematically. And I imagine they got to this week and were just like, what if we just match up like all the skin disease healing and called it a day thematically? Like, who doesn't love a good skin disease healing themed day? So anyway, last week I noted some of my gripes with the updated edition of the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible we've been using for worship. And just so none of you know that I'm not all negative about change, the two lessons this week actually have updates that I think are good changes. So the traditional way to translate both these passages in English is to say Naaman and then the 10 men Jesus healed were suffering from leprosy. However, the Bible uses the word traditionally translated as leprosy as like a catch-all term for any number of skin diseases. And in modern English, leprosy refers to a very specific skin disease, also called Hansen's disease, and none of the people in the Bible would have had that. So the updated edition of the New Revised Standard Version says Naaman and the 10 men in the gospel all had skin diseases, which is a much clearer translation, in my opinion. But today, I'm going to focus on the Old Testament lesson about Naaman, because Naaman isn't a particularly well-known Bible character, but he's got a fair amount to teach us. So we're told he's a commander in the army of the king of Aram, and some older Bibles will translate Aram as Syria, so sometimes Naaman is called Naaman the Syrian. And Aram is a kingdom that is on again, off again at war with Israel. And at this precise moment, they're currently at peace. Now, despite Naaman being from a people that's often an enemy of Israel, he's given quite a positive introduction. We're told he's a great man, a mighty warrior, and he's held in high favor. However, despite everything Naaman has going for him, he's afflicted by a very visible skin condition. And while we aren't given any direct insight into how Naaman felt about his condition, the fact that we have a whole story about him trying to get healed indicates that he was feeling pretty desperate to be cured. And that's really understandable. If anyone here has suffered from even a normal skin condition like acne, most of us can be really self-conscious with how we look. And regardless of what we're going through, lots of people reach a point where they can be willing to do almost anything for a cure. Whether it's weight loss, clear skin, or a cure for something more serious like cancer, people can be desperate for a miracle, desperate to be healed. So Naaman is suffering from this skin condition, and at the same time, he's got a servant from Israel, a young girl who was captured on a raid, and she serves Naaman's wife. And she tells the wife that there is a prophet in Israel who could cure Naaman. And Naaman and his wife seize on this chance and bring it to their king. And the king of Aram decides to help Naaman meet the prophet. So the king sends a letter to the king of Israel. Now it seems likely that the king of Aram assumed the prophet Elisha must be working for the king of Israel. However, that is not the case. And to further complicate things, the letter from the king of Aram actually doesn't mention the prophet Elisha at all. It just says, "I have sent you my servant Naaman, that you may cure him of his skin disease." And in response, the king of Israel tears his clothes in despair. Now, what's going on here is the king of Israel has interpreted this letter from the king of Aram as an impossible demand that can't be met to serve as a pretext for going to war. Like at the beginning of World War I, in response to Serbian nationalists assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary drew up a list of demands for Serbia to meet in order to avoid war. However, the demands were intentionally impossible for Serbia to agree to. It was just theater to be able to claim that Serbia refused demands and was then free to go to war with. And this sort of situation is how the king of Israel is perceiving what's going on. He thinks the king of a foreign nation is demanding that he personally work a miracle to cure Naaman. And when that doesn't happen, he fears that Aram is going to war with them. So the king of Israel tears his clothes in despair because he thinks his country is about to be attacked. That's why he talks about the king of Aram looking to pick a quarrel. And it does make you wonder, how many major conflicts in the world have started simply from misunderstandings. Israel and Aram are now on the brink of war simply because the king of Aram wasn't specific in his letter. So word gets out that the king of Israel is quite distraught by this demand to cure Naaman, and the news gets all the way to the prophet Elisha, who tells the king it's going to be okay. Elisha tells the king to send Naaman his way so that Naaman might learn that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman goes to Elisha's house, and Naaman goes with a whole impressive entourage. He's got horses and chariots. This is a whole display of how important and successful he is. But when Naaman gets to Elisha's house with all the king's horses and all the king's men, Elisha doesn't even go out to talk to him. Elisha sends a messenger who tells Naaman he'll be cured if he goes to wash 7 times in the Jordan River. And this infuriates Naaman. Naaman is a very important and successful man, and yet Elisha wouldn't even come out and speak with him. And what's worse is the cure Elisha prescribes is to wash in the River Jordan, a backwater foreign river. If the cure is just washing, why wouldn't one of the rivers of his homeland do? So Naaman goes off in a huff with his pride wounded, and likely also feeling incredibly disappointed. He'd come all the way to Israel and had nothing to show for it. And I know a number of people here have been through trials for cancer treatment or have friends or relatives who have, and sometimes those experimental trials can be desperate last-ditch hopes. And sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't. And that disappointment of having a little hope only to have that hope taken away can be devastating. Now, Naaman isn't dealing with a life or death condition, but that disappointment would still be there, along with the despair of feeling that perhaps he would never be normal, never look like everyone else, and would always be looked down on despite all of his success. But Naaman's servants decide to intervene. They tell him to try what the prophet said, especially because it was so easy. And they even point out that Naaman was desperate enough to have done some great feats to get a cure, if that had been what Elijah had said to do. So Naaman considers what his servants say, and he decides to listen to them. So he goes to the River Jordan and washes just as Elisha had said, and it works. He's cured. So Naaman goes back to Elisha with his whole entourage, and Naaman confesses his faith in the God of Israel. He essentially converts to worshiping the Lord God. And he says he'll worship no other God. And then he tries to offer Elijah payment for curing him, and Elijah refuses to accept it. And then Naaman makes an odd request for a bunch of dirt. And what's going on there is Naaman assumes that the Lord God of Israel can only be worshipped in Israel itself. And he assumes, like many people of his time, that each god kind of had their own zone of control. So he asked for a bunch of dirt from Israel to essentially have a mini Israel with him in Aram. So Naaman's heart here is in the right place, but he doesn't have a full understanding that God is God everywhere. And then there's also a discussion about going into the house of Naaman for worship. And what Naaman is trying to sort out is whether the Lord God would be okay with him going to worship on state occasions with the king of Aram when offerings are made to Naaman, who is the god of the Arameans. Naaman's position as an important general would mandate his participation in those religious rituals. And now, instead of lecturing Naaman about theology or trying to correct him or shame him, Elisha tells Naaman to go in peace. It seems Naaman's heart being in the right place is enough. So there are a number of things we could talk about with this story, but the thing that's sticking out to me this week is how the very powerful and important Naaman only finds the cure he's been seeking through listening to his servants, through listening to people who had much lower social status than him. And Naaman listens to his servants multiple times. At first, he listens to the girl who tells him that there's a prophet who could help. Naaman could have dismissed this. He could have been offended that this girl was talking about his condition. He could have been too proud to listen to a foreign girl and simply dismissed what she said as an idle tale. But he decides to trust what the girl had told him. And then once Naaman gets to Elisha and goes away in a rage because the prophet didn't come out to meet him and told him to wash in the Jordan, it's Naaman's servants who convince Naaman to give things a try. He certainly didn't have to listen to them, and in a lot of ways, his anger at his reception was justified. It was a bit of a snub to go all the way to Elisha and for Elijah to not even come out and say hello. But Naaman heeds the advice of his servants, and he's cured. If he dismissed their views as unimportant or unworthy of his consideration, he wouldn't have been healed. Now, this feature of the story tells us a couple things. The first is that it tells us something of the character of Naaman and his leadership. Naaman is someone who realizes there's great value in listening to people, even people who are below him. Lots of people who end up in charge of things can end up surrounding themselves with yes men who only tell them what they want to hear and where new ideas and dissent are punished. But Naaman seems to have cultivated a culture where people who serve under him are comfortable speaking up, even when their ideas conflict with Naaman's initial plans. And because Naaman is a leader who listens to advice, it's because of that listening that he's healed. And it's very possible that this aspect of Naaman's leadership is how he became so successful to begin with. Being a good leader involves being willing to listen and change course when you learn new information. Now, the other important aspect of Naaman only being cured because he listened to his servants is that this feature of the story tells us about God. God does not see as mortals sees, but looks on the heart. God values things differently than the world does. People society dismisses as valueless are valuable to God, and we see this expressed often in the people God decides to work through. One of the most Christian aspects of The Lord of the Rings is that the world isn't saved by great and mighty men fighting in epic battles, but the world is really saved in the core books through the bravery of small hobbits who are plucked out of their unremarkable everyday lives. It's the most ordinary and least remarkable seeming characters, the hobbits, who manage to destroy the ring and save the day. And God is constantly working through people no one else would think to pick. In the story of Naaman, the people who move things forward are lowly servants. The mighty King David starts off as a lowly shepherd boy. The disciples in the New Testament who go on to spread the gospel to the ends of the earth start off as lowly fishermen and sinful tax collectors. God works through unimportant, unexpected, ordinary people to bring about extraordinary things. And in a time where so much is going on in our world and we can feel powerless and unable to make a difference, the good news of the gospel is that God constantly works through ordinary people, like you, like me, like people we see on the street, at school, at work. God works through all of those people to change the course of the future. God chooses to work through everyday people to make a difference and to bring this kingdom on earth ever closer to that kingdom in heaven. And there's no limit to what God might accomplish through you or through anyone we might meet.